Yeah, the topic that was coming up was how very often, when I met people from different faiths or different traditions, it's this idea that all the different world religions have radically different doctrines and cannot actually be coherently
Oh,
brought together.
yeah, that's a very good one.
Yeah,
I mean, that's actually among all the comments that I see on the Bridging Beliefs channel,
yeah,
that question seems to pop up. Um,
more than any other.
yeah, like
Yeah,
once in a while, just keeps coming back. I mean, there's the whole video you have on this subject of the unity of religions, of how um, these seemingly contradictory, fundamentally contradictory worldviews and religions cannot all ever be seen as coming from the same source. Um, but yet, I think, I don't know, maybe I'm assuming most people don't watch that anyway, but it may be helpful too, because it's a 4 or 5 hour
yeah,
um,
yeah.
long video, and there's so much to cover, and it's important. It's not like it was dragged out. There's
No,
so much ground that needs to be covered to truly appreciate that. And it's such a big question. You shouldn't expect a quick answer to a huge question. And so maybe it would help putting it into a sort of a dialogue format.
yeah, I think it is super challenging. I know in the short form of it,
Like to empathize.
well, one, starting there, surely we grow up, say, particularly if we're growing up in a specific tradition, right? It's like, Buddhism looks super alien, right? You say, I grew up Catholic, actually. I went to a Catholic school. And, something like Buddhism, even just like, or Hinduism at the time when I was young, just seemed strange. And, I don't know, six-armed gods and blue people. And,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? It looks really bizarre. I know one of the examples, I hope this is somewhat helpful. One of the examples I remember giving with my son and my daughter is like when you go, I lived in Asia, right, with Jenny, my wife, and when we went there, um, one, I remember the first thing I noticed that there were swastikas everywhere,
Mm.
meaning like what looked like a Nazi symbol.
Yeah.
The second thing that I remember, like artistically, it's interesting. We had a conversation recently about the arts. Is there were all these demons?
Yeah.
There were demons.
These horned creatures. And,
Yeah, fierce, vicious, violent-looking
yeah.
creatures on temples, right? And we actually know what this happened. So this is one thing I would like to say quickly:
Yeah.
is that when the West actually appeared, say for example in India, you're seeing these fierce demons, scary creatures, right? Which look like devils, which
Yeah.
look like how we would depict
To,
devils,
to a Western eye, yeah, for sure.
right? And no joke, I gave this example to Eli and Laylee, and I said, so you come up, you're like, wow, these people worship demons. I know it was out of anachronistic. We know they got like, Nazi symbols up here, right?
Yeah.
I know that's kind of meshing two different periods of time. And it's interesting that I said, but like, you take that, those are actually bodhisattvas. They're angels.
Oh,
Yeah. So oftentimes you'll have even expressions of the divine within the history of India, particularly shown as fearsome and dark because they're battling back the forces of darkness, right? And I remember saying to them yet it's interesting because imagine the opposite historical channel,
yeah.
right?
Like if the Thai Buddhists would have,
Appeared in
yeah,
Europe.
England or something.
Well, and they did, right? But imagine you really heard the cultural story
Yeah.
from the opposite side.
Yeah.
Like one, angels in the New Testament, well, really, predominantly in the Old Testament, are not pretty creatures. Do you know what I
In
mean?
the Old Testament.
No.
Yeah, yeah.
When you
There's
see,
these like viral, famous videos on YouTube that you can see, like
Like a-
biblically accurate.
Angels?
Just search biblically accurate angels.
yeah, they're terrifying.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you got like wheels and wheels, and
Eyes.
flame and eyes and wings, and they're actually terrifying.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Like if you saw that thing,
And
in
they're
the
described
park,
as terrifying in the Bible.
yes, they are.
The when the angel of the Lord came and they were terrified and they
Yeah.
prostrated before this glory of the Lord.
And this is what's shocking.
Yeah.
If you walked out into like a local park and you saw that object,
Yeah.
that being, you would be horrified.
Yeah.
Absolutely horrified. Right? And it's interesting. You then move in, say, for example, into like a church or a cathedral, and I'm not remotely trying to be irreverent, but there's a torture machine
Yeah.
on the wall and a dead man.
Yeah.
Right? How? And this is very difficult culturally. And to me, in some sense, it's part of being culturally intelligent, where you can actually place yourself in that position, understand that that's not actually what is really being symbolized there, but how that would be seen by the average person
Yeah.
who came from a completely different tradition, right?
Yeah.
A seraphim, a cherubim, an ophanim, right? These beings are horrifying. Torture chambers, and do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's because of our lack of ability to sense that from the other side that has actually caused this. How is this related? I mean, very often we encounter something like Buddhism or Hinduism, and there's just a knee-jerk reaction, right?
Yeah.
Automatically, well, they can't possibly be the same. There's different words, there's different terms, there's different ways of saying things. So that's one, that just like the really shockingly jarring difference.
Well, these are like iconographical differences between the religions.
Yep.
And I think you're trying to draw the parallel to textual
I'm just using it as an analogy.
differences. Yeah, as an analogy for the textual differences
Yeah.
that we.
But they are differences that we see.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, yes, they're both an analogy and an example, right?
Yeah.
But yes, then you go into many of the classic ones. For example, Trinity in the New Testament, and Islam rejects the Trinity.
Even within the Bible, the Tanakh, and how a Jew would see
Christianity.
Christianity
But-
is probably the best example.
Yeah,
you
but
can
this
use.
is the problem. This is one of the classic examples.
Human sacrifice, like drinking and eating
Okay.
the blood
And
of.
again, this is not trying to be, and I know you're not either. It's
No.
not trying to be irreverent, but this is the example of not being able to empathize,
Yeah.
right? Like there's two, and I'll use both an Eastern and a Western example.
Yeah.
Yes, you have, and I've actually just recently been trying to address this on Bridging the Beliefs with Divine Sophia. And we're going to be actually going
related.
through this.
Yeah.
Because you have, as simply as you put it, try to look at the Christian dispensation, not from Christianity's perspective, now 2,100 years out. You know what I mean? 2,000 plus, right? Try and look at it from the perspective of the Jew who had to accept it.
Right.
Why doesn't that really happen?
Yeah.
Because the Christian world won the socio-political battle, right? They became ascendant,
Dominant culture.
became the dominant culture,
Yeah.
so that's not put forward regularly. So there is a sense in which, and this is something we plan to do in the future, right, on Bridging Beliefs, whereas it's, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones.
The Jewish objection studies.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because you really do have, from the Jewish perspective, you're waiting for Elijah. And we plan to do many of these things.
Yeah.
But you're waiting for the coming of Elijah. Who was Elijah? One of the great and powerful prophets of the Old Testament, who went up onto a mountain and was carried away in a chariot of fire.
You could spend a good 6 hours just simply on empathizing with how foreign and how borderline evil Christianity may have looked like to
From a Jewish
a
perspective.
practicing Jew. Honestly, there's so many depths and layers and examples that you can pull
Yeah.
to really illustrate the point. And I think it's maybe 6 hours is too long, but there's a certain extent where it needs to be really, really appreciated. And I think with that appreciation comes the humility that's necessary to approach this subject carefully, and a willingness to study it systematically, with patience.
Yeah.
Because I think the the approach that most people take, either from the side that says, oh, these things are so obviously different, for these are contradictory, or on the opposite side, where some Christians might do with their approach to Jewish text and the Old Testament's synchronicity with the New Testament. It's and saying, I mean, it's so obvious and so easily recognizable.
Yeah.
Jesus came and he did miracles. Like they would have to been blind to not have.
That's generally how it's seen.
Yeah, and that's also, I think, an unfair approach as well.
Yeah, I think it's in many ways aggressively unfair, to be honest.
And that's how I think so many are able to just immediately, blindly, reject false and true prophets by assuming it's just so easy. But starting with that assumption, which is wrong, which isn't biblical, which isn't scriptural, or not what happened historically even.
No, and this is why the analogy of the bodhisattvas. Because you get off the boat.
Yeah.
Demon, done.
Yeah. Swastika's demon.
Yeah. Right. And then the Buddhist monk lands, torture.
Yeah.
Right? Human sacrifice game, goodbye.
Yeah.
And no joke, come on. Particularly human sacrifice when it comes from a Buddhist perspective, or for that matter, a Jewish perspective. What am I talking about? The sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross for the sins of the world, which I don't mean to actually be in any way irreverent towards. It's trying to take that, right, out of the context where we don't see it and pull it to where we're like, wait a minute. From a Jewish perspective, humans shouldn't be sacrificed. From a Jewish perspective, right? I'll now finish the example. We're waiting for the coming of Elijah who ascended bodily into the sky. He didn't die, right? So we have kosher food laws. We're against human sacrifice, and we're waiting for Elijah. Yeah. Then all of a sudden, this guy shows up. No Elijah.
No.
Right? We're not going to follow the law anymore. And the entire image that is central to this theme is human sacrifice. And you have to eat my body and drink my blood.
Yeah.
It is in no way attempting to be irreverent. Right? It's funny, we had
you can do as many miracles as you want. That's not going to...
That's right.
Sit.
And it's interesting. Yeah, you want to do as many miracles as you want, but you're asking me to worship this strange God.
Yeah.
I don't want to go into it right now, but you have texts in the Old Testament that if someone comes and they're showing signs and wonders, but they ask you to follow a strange God.
Oh, wow.
Let's say you deal with them very aggressively. Okay?
Put it nicely.
To put it very, very nicely.
Yeah.
Right? And yet here you have a tradition which on the surface looks like a Fang Bodhisattva.
Yeah.
That's what it really is to me. And it seems to be drawing you away from the tradition that you're supposed to be holding fast to. It seems even in itself to be a Hellenizing influence at the time. I just mentioned this to an acquaintance of mine where I said, you've just fought a war, which is called the Maccabean, First and Second Maccabees. So you've just battled against Hellenizing Greek influences that seem to be trying to take you away from things like circumcision and the kosher food laws and the prescription against idols. You're being, right, you just warred, right? And then you got beat by them, and now you're under the Romans, another little Greco-Roman influenced tradition, and now all of a sudden you have this God-man human sacrifice, get rid of your Jewish law thing coming.
Yeah.
Why? And I again, not remotely trying to actually be, because both of us accept the New Testament. We both accept Jesus Christ as the embodiment of God's word and wisdom, right, on the plane of history. Yet what is happening here? This is something that often, for me, I'm sorry, I'm rambling for a second, but it's what often is missed when you take a look at Buddhism. I think I mentioned this within one of the Buddhist teachings and the deepenings there, is that when you actually begin to look at Buddhism from the perspective of Hinduism, it actually takes on the same picture. It's jarring.
Yeah.
Buddhism to the Hindu world seems to be taking their gods, pushing them down, going against a lot of their social laws and teachings. Now, again, I don't want to go off on this because this is one particular node. What is the core point of this? If you're going to get off the boat and look at a foreign tradition and you just see something that looks sort of scary to you and you're like, these people are evil, right? This has nothing to do with what we see.
Yeah.
This has nothing to do with my culture. That's fine. If you're a Jew, you would have done it to Christianity. And if you have, and I think I can sum up what you were saying, Sharon, is if you actually have a perspective on the investigation of the potential reality of another prophet or message from God, if that method would lead you, say, as a Christian, to have rejected Jesus Christ in the first century,
Method, yeah.
we know something's wrong.
That's the key. I think that's what the conversation has to revolve around, is how do we understand the method in which God expects us to recognize him? What method does he want us to use? Is it a method that's super obvious? Is it a method that's easy? Is it a method that's going to be perfectly in line with what was previously said and virtually no difference? If not, why would he be doing it that way? Why would he be doing it in a way that's difficult or challenging or purposely creating a stumbling block for us? What is the...
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. Pun intended.
Yeah.
What quality does that bring out of us? What is it in that that he's trying to strengthen in us? Like, what is that? Like, what approach? And if it's like which is what we're putting out here, is that this careful and subtle and humble approach to investigating a prophetic claim in a way allows us to approach truth claims and things in general with an empathic and patient and humble approach. And in general, it actually applies to everything. It actually applies whether it's the social and political world, community, in school and in work, wherever we are.
People of different
dialoguing,
cultures and backgrounds.
Everything. If we were to take on this approach, there seems to be an underlying reason for which God is wants us to approach it in this way, and versus the other way, which is a very elementary, easy, obvious. Well, someone did a whole bunch of miracles and then he died and then came back from the dead. Well, obviously that's from God. You can't. A fool would only deny such a thing. But that's not what the story of the Bible is about. That's not what it's saying. In fact, it's saying the opposite, and how difficult it was, and how challenging it was, and how purposely challenging it was. That's the thing.
Yeah, and I think why?
Exactly why? Why is that? Why would God do it that way? Why would he want to make it a challenge? Is he playing games on us? Is he a trickster of some kind? What kind of low-key God is this?
Yeah, this actually gets back to the divine assayer, which we were talking about previously in one of these.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
I want to pause on that for a second,
because
that's a much bigger topic. The question that began this that we're looking at is, how can you claim that the various religions, and not all of them, like there was recently a comment like, well, what about Satanism and what about... No, the Baha'i faith doesn't accept every movement. It's often a misunderstanding. I would say this, at least there are movements that, while we don't acknowledge as being wholly divine in origin, we don't think they're demonic. We have a slight variation there.
Yeah.
But how do you bind this, conception of like what are the images given? Like the divine gardeners, for example, or the divine physician. That the manifestations of God throughout human history have been appearing in these evolutionary contexts as a physician who is to diagnose a sick patient and then give them a prescription to solve that sickness. And that they're coming in, a divine gardener, and tending it, trying to make it more fruitful and make it more beautiful, right? And yes, I understand that people are like, oh yeah, but they're utterly contradictory. The one thing is, Sharos, is that's a claim. Right? Like people say, well, obviously, like, you have all these completely contradictory faiths that are utterly at odds in their doctrines. Like, give me a break. To simplify this back a bit.
Why do you assume that's so?
Right.
That's what you should first ask.
Is this is the problem. The claim, like, and this is what I'm trying to do. Like, you tell me, wow, there's no ultimate reality in Buddhism. There's a whole video on this where it says, like, well, there's no gods in Buddhism. And if you remember, I say in that video, I guess there's no gods in Greco-Roman religion either. What did I mean by that? Well, there's all these divine beings everywhere.
Yeah.
Right? And even if you want to say, well, yeah, but there's no transcendent being, there's a part of which I say, well, no, wait a minute. You said that Buddhism, I'll use this as an example, is either atheistic or non-theistic.
Yeah.
Well, that's not true.
Yeah.
Like, let's be flat about that. That's actually not true. Are there transcendent entities within Buddhist cosmology that, let's just say, are billions of years old and exist outside this physical plane and govern Buddha fields and realities above us? And I'm going to ask very clearly, does that occur within the Pali Canon, which are the most ancient Jewish scriptures? Yes.
Buddhist scriptures.
Buddhist scriptures.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you're telling me that this is a non-theistic or atheistic religion.
Yeah.
How can that be merged with Christianity that has a triune God?
Yeah.
Right? One God, one essence, and three persons. However you want to put the Trinity.
Yeah.
Well, let's take it from both sides. Number one, that is a false statement about Buddhism.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying, well, how can you reconcile a non-theistic religion with a God where it's a triune being?
Yeah. Or to add in Hinduism in here, polytheistic.
Right. So then you're like, oh, well, you got all this, there's this polytheistic thing. There's all these gods.
Krishna, Agni, this, that.
Yeah, Varuna, like you start going through it. Okay. Once again, do you have, particularly within the Western conception, do you have a recognition that within the Bhagavad Gita, you have the presentation of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who embodies in a human frame and reveals itself as having revealed itself with endless name, like faces and bodies and names?
Yeah.
What do I mean by that? Is there a fundamental reality that one can find within the Hindu scriptures, be it the Upanishads, be it the Bhagavad Gita, right, or the Puranas themselves, where there is some fundamental reality that is embodying itself in all these different expressions?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can. But how we ended up having these presented is the average person is like, no, there's just like many gods here. It's a non-deistic religion. Then there's the triune God. And then there's, one God that isn't triune, as an example. It's interesting because they always mention Islam and they don't mention Judaism, which comes before Christianity.
Yeah.
Right? Which, I'm not trying to go fully back there, but it's like, well, there was no concept of a triune being in Judaism.
Yeah.
Or acceptable human sacrifice, or do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
It all loops around.
Yeah.
So how does a person of this tradition ask others to treat them when they're presenting their own tradition? You put it humbly and patiently. Let's try and be like, okay, tell me what that symbol means.
Yeah.
Let me try to understand what that says. So why did I apologize, why did I just ramble?
Yeah.
Because a vast majority of what people believe as the irreconcilable differences between the different traditions of our world are actually just false.
Yeah.
They're not real.
Even if it wasn't necessarily false, but let's just say from that those original texts, which we're using as our sources, not some Buddhist, scholar of some kind centuries after. We're looking at the original sources as our source for what we claim to be true. I think even if that were to be a legitimate interpretation of those texts, that in fact Hinduism, for example, is polytheistic, but you could just as fairly and just as accurately interpret them in a way that and can be understood in a way that harmonizes and
bridges those beliefs.
Is in line with say the Bible or the Quran and whatnot. If that's possible to do, not that we should read into it or force the text, interpolate it in some way that makes it so, but if it's legitimately able to be interpreted that way, to me, if you want to have that other interpretation, that's fine. And you think that again, I'm trying to go into the world of it not necessarily being false, like what you're saying.
Okay,
before,
yeah.
Right. It's not necessarily that interpretation of Hinduism is false. Let's just say it's even true and a legitimate way of looking at it. But if this is also another legitimate way of looking at the texts,
that isn't directly contradictory.
That isn't directly contradictory. At least I can speak for myself. I would want to see texts in that light. I would want to see them in that light. Why? Because I think an all-powerful God, who's the creator of this entire universe, and who loves his children, and who has, this is just something I fundamentally believe, that were he to create his children, he would communicate with them and guide them along in their own unique ways to him and to his knowledge and to his life, and not leave them in the dark for thousands and thousands of years, destined for hell or whatever, a dark state of consciousness. So if that's possible to do, that to me demonstrates the glory and a greater power of God than would one who doesn't, one who has this narrow, band or tribe that has only this unique revelation that's been given to it, and everyone else has been in utter darkness for thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of years. So I think that it's actually okay to have that as your approach, as long as we're doing it fairly and legitimately. We're not trying to twist text.
Yeah, you're not manipulating it.
Not manipulating, not like exaggerating. If that can be done, let's do that. That should be our MO.
I think there's even more to it. This does sound strange, but bear with me for a second. I am very, very glad that the vast majority of people think that these traditions are irreconcilable. Mm-hmm. Very glad. Which sounds backwards. Why? Because as you begin to see it being done, it becomes greater evidence for it, because the vast majority of people thought it was impossible.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I can't agree more.
Okay.
That to me
this
is one of the most powerful things.
To me, let's go back to the beginning of this. The fundamental question was, you got all these completely, bizarre, irreconcilable faiths. There really was, to me. I was a student of comparative religion before I was a Baha'i. I'm trying to understand sacred history of humankind.
Yeah.
I had come to a place where I believed there was a sacred. I had no idea what to call that. And for another day, that being had begun to communicate. Not begun to communicate, would have communicated.
Right.
Like you said, reaching out. The child is reaching up, it actually takes it. Okay? But there were divergencies between these different traditions.
Yeah.
Right? And at the same time, they also seem to have similarities. Do you know what I mean? And then going into it, seeing actually how through an Baha'i understanding, from an understanding of the revelation of Baha'u'llah, how these begin to be bridgeable.
Yeah.
So I hope that wasn't too much. It's that I am actually excited that the average individual within this world, because we're not just on the bandwagon. We're not just trying to, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Ride a wave. They are. It's to me very much like within the scientific world. Like you're saying, all these multiple biological entities all had a common origin. How absurd!
Yeah.
Here's a lemur. Over there's a turtle.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you're taking divergent biological organisms and you're saying it's impossible that these are the same,
Yeah.
right? How can that be a mammal? It's in the ocean. It's
Yeah.
like a dolphin or an orca. Well, how is it that we have come culturally throughout time to believe that these do have common origins? That we see these homologies, we actually see these patterns that actually show that they actually have a common origin. Intellectual investigation. Right? Putting aside our biases, put aside our desires to see them as separate, and being willing to look at the evidence as we walk down that road.
Yeah.
Being, as Abdu'l Baha says, open to learn everything anew again. That's what I had to do. Because it's trying to say, okay, well, everyone's telling me that, this organism and this organism and all these different flowers or all these different, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Biological organisms, whether in the plant or the animal, don't come from an origin, right? They're not rising out of one fundamental thing.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's look at that.
And at the same time, not look at it in a unjust and sloppy kumbaya mishmash utopian thing of, well, let's just all get along. We all have some, we all believe it's nice to be good. Things like that. But really, really take it seriously and look at the texts and where we find contradictions, see if there's a way to reconcile the differences, just as a Christian would to the texts and the contradictions in the Tanakh. It's the example you brought up earlier, where you're saying, just as they would want to reconcile and find ways to fairly and biblically reconcile the two and see ways in which they are truly one and the same.
Mm-hmm.
Why not take that same approach, if possible? I'm not saying it by definition will happen with every text and holy book out there, but try with the predominant faiths of our world. Because if you can find the voice of God, and that's your same shepherd that's speaking to other, flock out there throughout history, how much more beautiful to hear his voice in a different accent.
Actually, he has more kingdoms than he previously thought.
Yeah.
And I think this is, again, a lot of this in the Unity of Religion video has gone over. One, I cannot treat, as this came up in the Divine Sophia deepening and others, I'm not going to treat, let's say, the Jewish scriptures or the Christian scriptures as if they belong to someone else. What do I mean by that? They are empirically, they're a text I can look at. They're the heritage of humankind.
Yeah.
Then when I look at them, do I have to look at them from the creed of the Council of Nicaea?
Yeah, someone
Constantinople.
calls himself a Christian,
Or
and
Ephesus.
therefore you have to take it from there.
No, I don't. And I've had this happen
Authority.
very often. And, I've had someone say, well, for example, I'm a Buddhist. That's not what Buddhism teaches. I wasn't, and it's a weird way to put it, but I'm like, I wasn't talking about what Buddhism teaches.
Yeah.
I'm talking about what the Pali Canon says.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there is this sense.
You
where
have just as much access as I do to it.
I do.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying, like you said, to mash them together. Right? It's trying to be like, okay, well, that's very often throughout my life. I've been looked at anti-Baha'i texts, anti-Baha'i websites, tried to see how people see these divergencies. What I do find very often is actually what you just mentioned, which is there's a sense where, well, if I have an apparent contradiction within my fold, within my text, right? And often we were bringing up, for example, the Christian example, because we grew up in a Christian culture, largely, right? But it's like, if you're sitting there, well, the Buddha says this and the Buddha says that, how do we actually reconcile these together? But if the Buddha says this and Muhammad says that, there's no attempt at reconciliation because one isn't within the tradition.
Yeah.
Right? Often what's happening is that when we meet those foreign fanged beings, we're just automatically on the defensive, picking up swords and knives.
Yeah.
Right? To me, and what I most normally have is, on the one hand, I have regular experience of individuals who are, forgive me for a second, who are claiming definitive contradiction between traditions that aren't even there.
Yeah.
Then we have another set, which is there are apparent major difficulties and contradictions.
That are there.
But that really on the surface is like, oh, well, it's problematic, right? Yet what is strange is they have it inside their own tradition.
Yeah.
Like the one which I keep saying we'll go over, which is you have this example of you're waiting for Elijah.
Yeah.
You are waiting for a major Old Testament prophet that went to the top of a mountain and ascended bodily into heaven to return prior to the coming of your Messiah, who, from your perspective, let's say, is supposed to be the king of the world thereafter.
Yeah.
Right?
Established Jewish law.
Right. Now, what you have happen is that guy never shows up, right? There's some guy that gets asked, who's named John the Baptist, whether or not he is Elijah. He's actually asked this. And he's like, no, I am not Elijah. And then he dies. And then after the fact, when they're like, well, wait a minute, Jesus, if you're the Messiah, right? I thought Elijah was supposed to come first. And he says, well, if you will receive it, it was John the Baptist. Okay. Again, I apologize because oftentimes it seems like picking on the Christian contradictions. It's just purely for cultural connection. Okay. So you have here a figure who was supposed to come, went up on a mountain, and was ascended into heaven physically, at least in the story, right? That person's supposed to come back. Who would you be expecting?
Someone from the sky.
You're going to expect someone coming from the sky.
Yeah.
And you're going to expect Elijah, not a man named John.
And especially not a man who doesn't say he's Elijah.
That's the problem, especially when you go to and you're like, hey, are you Elijah? And he's like, I am not.
Yeah.
Okay. But in order to make him Elijah, you have to wait till he's dead and have another guy be like, oh, no, he was. Okay. That looks bad.
Well, what it
That
does,
actually looks bad.
to me, what it looks like is like, yeah, go ahead.
Done.
Yeah.
It actually looks like it's done.
Yeah.
Christianity, and again, I believe in Christianity, but that looks like Christianity is a false religion.
Yeah.
Out of the gate. Okay? But any Christian now, I'm assuming anyone who's watching this, is going to be chomping at the bit. Yeah. Well, what it really, if they even know about it. Yeah. And this is the other part. If they even know that John the Baptist is stated to be Elijah by Jesus Christ, even though John said he wasn't.
Yeah.
Okay. I remember having a conversation multiple times with friends where I say, okay. And I'll just use the example if it's okay. What would you be doing? I'll do it this way. What would you be doing as a Christian facing that problem? You would be going, okay, how did that work?
Yeah.
You're thinking, well, maybe there's a solution to this. I've got a series of contradictory data points to be like no more philosophy of scientific about this. No, platypus, I got a, siphonophore, I got a turtle. How do we understand how these are part of the same kingdom? Right? Which means you are, and you'd be in a very difficult place. In a sense, you should be like, okay, it's possible that maybe this isn't right. Right?
Yeah.
Maybe these aren't reconcilable, the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Yeah.
Right? But let's actually investigate further.
Yeah.
And anyone who might actually watch this is going to be like, yeah, you should. That's the point. That's the point. So what is this an example of? Well, for example, Baha'u'llah claims to be the return of Jesus Christ.
And Jesus
went on top of a hill and ascended physically into the sky. And I remember, and we will go over this in the future, I promise.
Yeah.
It seems like cat out of the bag on this one, because it's really intense. Either as a Christian, I'm just trying to give one example.
Yeah.
Either as a Christian, a deeply, profoundly important sacred figure from the ancient past can ascend into heaven bodily and yet come back through the womb
Yep.
of a normal person millennia after, and still in some sense be emblematic and symbolic and of the essence of that other person? Or Christianity is a false religion? Why?
You've shot yourself in the foot with the bullet that that would have also killed Christ.
Right. And why? Just so I don't keep
Yeah.
talking. Why?
Well, the methodology that you want to be used to accept and recognize who Jesus is suddenly the wrong methodology to use when another person has the exact same claims and proofs.
But more precisely, why? What is it? You believe that in order for Christianity to be true, that a historical prophet can actually go up on the top of the mountain and
Yeah.
ascend physically into the sky. In order for Christianity to be true, that has to be possible. That appears in the womb of the mother of John the Baptist.
It needs that.
Is actually essential.
Yeah.
Why am I giving this example? Because very often, throughout my life as a Baha'i, well, obviously, Baha'u'llah can never be the return of Christ. The return of Jesus Christ ascended, right? In the book, the beginning of the book of Acts, ascended into heaven
Yeah.
bodily, exactly like John the Baptist. Exactly like Elijah.
Elijah, yeah.
That doesn't make, and this is why I'm just trying to give one example, that doesn't make the Baha'i faith true.
Mm-hmm.
What it means is, like you said, I'm just trying to clarify, if you apply that form of immediate rejection of a tradition,
Yeah.
then you will be applying it to your own tradition, right? So
The corollary of that is that method of recognition is legitimate and not only legitimate, is actually essential in recognizing a true prophet.
what do you mean?
So what you're saying is if you use that methodology, or sorry, if you reject a prophetic claim outright
Well,
because it is not as expected as before and is expected to come supernaturally from the sky and etc., then you'd be rejecting your own
you actually would,
religion.
yeah.
The corollary of that is that the methodology in which you use to recognize your own religion is not only legitimate but an essential methodology that one ought to use.
Yeah, you actually would have had to pause.
Yeah.
To go back in time.
Yeah.
You would have had to been like, okay, on the surface, like the fierce Buddhist bodhisattvas,
Yeah,
that looks scary. That looks like that can't possibly be true.
yeah,
I'm now going to have to wait, right? I'm going to have to be patient, and I'm going to have to investigate in spite of something on the surface appearing different. That's
sorry, just
yeah.
to interject, it would be completely unfair and unjust to say that you could use that methodology for him, but never again.
right, and this is why it's a different category than just it's something jarring on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
There's a passage in the Tablet of Muhammad by Baha'u'llah where he says, "O people, if you deny this verses, by what proof have you believed in God?"
Beautiful.
Okay, what is that principle to me? And he says, "Produce it, O assemblage of false ones," right?
Yeah,
And they will not be able to point it up. The principle, which actually appears several other places within the writings of Baha'u'llah, is you have decided, right, that this proves your faith. Okay? Well, what is it?
yeah,
Or you have decided that this falsifies another claimant.
yeah.
Well, if we now find that problem in your own tradition,
It can't be.
it's going to kill your own, like you said, shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah,
Right? So, why was I bringing this up? On the one hand, you have contradictions that are being claimed to be between these different traditions, and they're not remotely there. Other times, there are contradictions that on the surface, you're like, oh, okay, that looks like a problem, but upon deeper investigation, actually swiftly start to disappear. Then you have contradictions that are claimed like death blows, for example, say to a Baha'i perspective.
yeah,
or say to an Islamic perspective, say from the Jewish camp or the Christian camp, yet they have the same problem. That problem exists in their own tradition. So there's a sense where I've actually said this to friends. I'm like, you know what? That's a really good point. Just use the Elijah one and John the Baptist. It is a really troubling thing. How can that be? Well, given you have the same problem, how did you solve it over the last 2,000 years?
Perfect. Yeah.
Right? And very often what happens is that hasn't yet been seen. Right? The other, and then I know I go into this in the unity of religion, where it's like, okay, well, you're saying, for example, let's say a context, a concept we will be looking at shortly, again, where it's like, well, what about war in Islam? Okay.
Yep. And not war by all Muslims throughout history,
No.
but specifically
within the Quran,
by the
let's
Prophet
say
Muhammad.
the life of the Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah.
Okay. There really is a sense in which it's like, okay, well, if you're, say, from the Judeo-Christian tradition, what about wars and the conquest of Canaan? I'm just trying to make the same point again.
Yeah.
What about, for example, the conquest under Joshua? What about some of the military actions, for example, of Moses? And thereafter.
All sanctioned by God.
All sanctioned by God. Okay, how, and this isn't a trap. It's like, well, how do you understand those things?
Yeah.
Because I would like to see how you have come to a place of peace and understanding as yourself with them. Because what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So if you actually develop certain principles and understandings about how that could be, let's now see if they actually apply over here.
Yeah.
Right? That would be just.
Yeah.
The challenge I often have, and this is something in many other places I go into very heavily.
Mm-hmm.
The Baha'i faith teaches the independent investigation of truth. I don't never come up with the best way to put this, but there is a radical difference between investigating to see if something is true and educating yourself to prove something is wrong.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And it's hard to stress how different these are. In there is a manuscript I'm working on, another book I'm working on, and I said it's like a telescope, right? It's like you pull that telescope up, and I'm gonna scrutinize.
Yeah.
But when I turn that on you, I'm looking for all the stray hairs and pores and oily face. Sorry. But when I want you to inspect me, I go like this. If I put the big part, I look really, really far away.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's no scrutiny on myself, but there's the profound scrutiny on you.
Yeah.
So that's one side. And actually, in the manuscript I'm writing, this is a telescope. A telescope is to be able to see far and to inquire. Mm-hmm. But you can use that telescope for military purposes. Mm-hmm. It becomes a military telescope.
Yeah.
I call it a hoploscope, which means like a weapon scope. All of a sudden, your investigative, rational mind has actually taken on what we call a polemic.
Yeah.
Right?
As opposed to an apologetic.
Well, even that. Often apologetics, which is, for many people, right, means from reason, to answer from reason, right? Not saying sorry. But even that, very often it's like, well, I got to fight for my own.
Yeah.
And this is tragedy.
Yeah.
It really is. That's not an independent investigation of truth. Very often what happens is it is educating yourself to prove some other one's wrong. It's funny, even in this context, I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot. Even in this context, Shadows, I've had people say, well, aren't you just reading a lot to see how you can fit them all together? I've actually said this, where I'm like, aren't you reading a lot just to show how they can't be put together?
Yeah.
Which is kind of what you were saying before.
How many atheist academic or scholars of the New Testament are there? How many, experts on the Quran who are, Christian or Hindu or whatever they might be, are there that know it inside out? all the texts, all the quotes. They could verbatim quote you
Yep.
passages, but yet missing completely this principle that you're talking about.
I think so much of political, social, philosophical dialogue, interreligious dialogue is utterly and completely governed by, I hope you will afford me this, what I call like hoploscopic and aeroscopic desires. It's not a telescope.
Yeah.
You're not bringing it up to look to the heavens. You're not. No, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
What you're doing is you're using it for warfare.
Yeah.
That same instrument, which is meant to look at the actual sky and the stars, to see far for humankind to explore,
Yeah.
can be used to track people so you can assassinate them.
Yeah.
It's actually why I like the image. But at the exact same time, I can use that same telescope to peep in someone's window,
Yeah.
invade their privacy, to make them an object of my lust. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's the same thing. Very often it's tragic to me. And again, we're just talking here, but it really is tragic. Because what's happening is it's like, I'm going to pick this thing up and I am ready for war.
This method of being really cautious and trying to be sympathetic as much as possible in the investigative process, I think is also true even for claims that the majority of us would recognize as false. Trying to think of an example that would be somewhat diplomatic and not upsetting.
Tough.
Yeah.
Which is the point. Go ahead.
But whatever. That's some example of an easy example I could give is like David Koresh and his works that he might have.
Yeah.
But maybe a slightly more or slightly more potentially offensive one would be like the Book of Mormon.
Okay. Yeah.
Hopefully no Mormons are upset by this, but something that like a text that I would not recognize as divine.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say that. I would still expect the approach to that, whether from myself or anybody else, to be just as careful, just as thorough, and even in my judgment of it, to be really carefully and contextually framed and how and what and to what degree I have determined for it to be false.
Yeah.
Again, to use the Book of Mormon as an example, to say that it's, for example, maybe something that's I could say is uninspired or maybe not proven to be from the Word of God, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that it was malicious or absolute nonsense or false or from Satan or this and that. Maybe it's not a good example to use, but I'm just trying to say that when we're approaching it, always having in the back of our mind that I could be rejecting a true prophet here, and I'm going to be really careful.
That's the scary part.
Right?
And it is the scary part. Go ahead.
Because it's a powerful weapon.
Yeah. This is actually it really is tough, particularly because I know I have a very large presentation on our site. And I say our site because you do so much work for this.
Unity of Religions?
No.
Which one?
The Afterlife.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I really do charge and ask people to look at the Unity of Religion one, because it gives so much to this. And even strategies I myself use. Looking at the original text, obviously. Looking at this, the history. Looking at the social context. The evolutionary niche, if you will, in which this came, trying to do our best to try to understand some of the original languages. The surrounding milieu, which, like, for example, with Divine Sophia, one of the most recent videos, is trying to say, like, well, what was going on around this claim when this claim came out?
Yeah.
Right? Actually, the strange one is I actually meant the Afterlife video. Right? Because in the Afterlife video, it is, like, I may be rarer as a Baha'i, right? But I tried to present there what I believe, and I hope this is okay as a weird segue. I don't think this is the only time we do this.
Do what?
What is that? Find the manifestation of God.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that.
Mm-hmm.
I believe we are rewarded in all facets of our expansion as conscious beings. What do I mean by that? That we are supposed to try to the best of our ability, reach the apex of our intellectual development. To try to learn to actually submit or bend our will towards the sacred, whichever way you prefer, in that, and to seek as much truth as we can to try and recognize divinity as precisely as we can in this life. And then, if you will, to mirror forth that divine from our life, which I'm not all that good at.
Right.
So, what are we trying to do? Is to, like, because you said, I don't want to reject the true prophet. I want to try and be careful, right? And it's interesting.
I've actually searched like Scientology, like videos, text. I've,
Oh,
like,
yeah.
like really, and
Yeah.
again, I try to really use that same approach
Yeah.
of like, no, I'm not going to go into it thinking this is all nonsense, made up garbage. I'm going to go into it being like, let's, test the fruits.
Yeah. As you're supposed to.
Yeah.
I even, again, there's too many of these. There's a whole video on bridging beliefs that talks about the fountain of knowledge, the fountain of understanding, and the fountain of beauty.
It was one of the first videos.
And it was one of the first videos put out on this topic, because it's like, well, first try and learn about that thing. Okay? Just try and know what it is, the basic trivia and data. Very often, we don't even do that level.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, well, how do I understand it as a cohesive whole? Obviously, it's a whole presentation, so I say a lot on it. But it's like, okay, well, how do I see it from its own perspective? How do I begin to understand? And again, I don't have to agree. Just how do I begin to think from the perspective of Buddhism?
Yeah.
Right? What is the worldview? Not just, oh, these are its scriptures, and these are its dates, and these are its holy days, and you know what I mean? The sort of like just Jeopardy trivia level stuff.
Yeah.
How do I begin to actually grasp it and understand it and better unravel what's inside here? But then the third, which was the fountain of beauty, why is it that it has caught the breath of people for 2,500 years? Why is it seen as beautiful? And automatically people think, oh, he means you have to agree with it. I don't. I mean literally that. What has it been capturing the hearts of humankind for 2,500 years? And someone will say, well, what about Taoism or Confucianism? Yeah, what about Taoism? Why was Taoism capturing the hearts of people?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And, you were talking about Scientology. Like I had a friend years and decades ago who just come out and be like, hey, I got this, my girlfriend's really, she's dating this guy, he's a Satanist. Right? Which like shocking. And it's like, well, how do I, combat him? I don't know, you study this kind of stuff. And I'm like, have you ever read the Satanic Bible? And this sounds really bad to many people. So I went and read it. I hadn't read it. Right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting. And again, that sounds really crazy.
No, and again, it's not like it's saying that you have determined now that the Book of Satan is Satanic Bible is true. But the fact that we ought to take the approach to these kinds of claims seriously and with the due diligence we'd expect our own.
What it was is I knew nothing about that.
Yeah.
That's actually what that means.
And to say any claims about it when you haven't actually read its sources is unjust. Simple as that.
Yeah, and it seemed the most egregious example I can give.
Yeah.
Right? Is I'm like, okay, well, even the fact that if you want to help this person, right? But you have no idea what that person believes.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a beautiful quote by Abdu'l-Baha. It says that where if a spiritually enlightened Muslim wants to teach the Christian, no matter how much he gives the Christian of the beauties and the eloquences of
the Quran,
will never be able to reach the heart of that Christian. But whereas if he were to know the Bible better than his own, that person's own priests know the Bible.
And the glorious melodies of the
and
gospel.
the glorious merit of the gospel.
Yeah, that's actually what it
He would
says.
be able to connect the heart of that Christian to his own.
Even in this analogy, from the Christian perspective, did Jesus go into hell to save people?
Mm-hmm.
That's actually why I was telling the story of the satanic Bible.
Oh,
Are you willing to go to where someone is
yeah,
to try and pull them out?
beautiful.
Right? Are you willing?
Very, very
know,
bodhisattva-ish.
And interestingly, ironically, spinning around.
Yeah.
What does a bodhisattva do? The bodhisattva can enter nirvana if they want, to end all suffering.
Yeah.
Right? And yet that being chooses to stay not only in this world, but come here.
Yeah.
And to embody compassion for all beings to help them become saved. Very Christ-like. Right?
Right.
and it's funny that that's what, to me, is part of all this is about. I think we
do need to like get into this and actually bring up like examples and go, example by example, quote by quote, say in the Bible or in the theological descriptions of God or the manifestations in each of these texts, and go one by one and try to see where the differences are, and then see how we can reconcile them. Because ultimately, this whole conversation has been about the approach and the introduction. But I think that one day that video needs to be made.
And again, that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
As we're moving through. To me, I guess to sum up this whole chunk, it's like a vast number of the so obvious apparent contradictions between religions. Well, they're not there. That's simply because you have a very skewed form. Very often, we have to remember that there is a diversity of different traditions within a single tradition. So very, it might be that, you're, say, from a Pentecostal church, for example, so this is what Christianity teaches. And the assumption is that that's the only way that Christianity teaches that. Or like, you're, say, an Ismaili Muslim. So true Islam is this, right? So that's your perspective. When that might actually be very diverge quite drastically from what the Quran teaches. You know what I mean? So very often we have a skewed vision of, like you said, let's like, I've had people say, well, obviously Buddhism is this. My friends are Buddhists.
Yeah.
Again, I don't care what your friends are. You know what I mean? I care about them as people, but I don't care what they believe their religion to say.
Yeah.
And then the other side is yes, there really are at times seeming divergences that we have to, if you will, put away our hoploscopic, you know what I mean? Like directed skepticism is what I mean by that.
Yeah.
Like militant-like skepticism. We got to put that aside, just take up the actual telescope and investigate it openly.
Yeah.
And then try and see if there's a way that these can actually be seen and the same. And then actually be open to the possibility of that. Don't educate ourselves to prove something wrong, but actually investigate to see if it's true. And I know there was one thing you mentioned, which it doesn't come up much. To be as worried about rejecting a true prophet or true avatar or true Buddha as you are of accepting a false one.
Yeah.
And that, again,
Totally.
is not touched on.